Welcome to The Critique. Today we are analyzing a deeply evocative script about undergoing a profound identity transformation, metaphorically described as a life reset. Let's dive right into the feedback.
Yeah, let's get right into it. So a key theme running through this material seems to be the firm distinction between undergoing a life reset and experiencing clinical depression.
Right, and it's a theme that hits you immediately in the opening paragraphs.
It really does. The author does an incredible job validating these heavy feelings of emptiness and emotional detachment. But looking at the execution, we have to ask a critical question about the audience. The weakness here is the risk that focusing solely on the spiritual or evolutionary aspects of this reset might overlook the genuine mental health reality of the audience.
Existential weight of the reader's experience. They're, deliberately pushing back against a society that frequently pathologizes every uncomfortable emotion.
And I completely respect that rebellious edge.
It's powerful.
It's very powerful. The weakness, however, lies in how absolute that rebellion becomes. Early on, the script makes a very stark declaration. It says, "This isn't depression, though everyone will try to convince you it is."
Yeah, I flagged that line too.
Right? Now, while the intention is clearly to empower the listener, framing the reset in direct opposition to depression risks alienating listeners who might actually be experiencing both. It inadvertently forces the audience to choose between spiritual growth and psychological care.
I see exactly what you mean. If a reader is feeling a profound level of numbness, they might already be hesitant to seek professional help.
Exactly.
We certainly don't want the narrative to inadvertently build a wall between the reader and a therapist who could actually help them process this transition. But look at it from the author's angle. If we dial back that absolute statement, do we risk losing the punchiness of the message? Like, how do we keep that fierce validation without giving potentially harmful advice?
That is the exact tension we need to resolve here. So the suggestion is to nuance this distinction by explicitly acknowledging that profound identity shifts can coexist with or deeply mimic clinical issues.
Okay, so blending the two.
Right. You don't have to back away from the spiritual premise at all. You just need to soften that rigid boundary. Acknowledge that a major life recalibration takes a heavy toll on the nervous system, and that seeking psychological support is a totally valid tool for navigating it. Doing this makes the message safer, far more inclusive, and honestly, much more aligned with the reader's complex reality.
I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this on a practical, sentence-by-sentence level. We need to maintain that protective tone, but weave in a safety net.
Let's look at some concrete examples for improvement. Instead of outright dismissing the concept of depression, you can reframe the text to say something like, while it might look and feel exactly like depression to everyone around you, and it's absolutely vital to honor your mental health during this time, what's happening at your core is also a profound identity shift.
I really like that. It validates the biological reality but keeps the focus on the existential shift.
Right. Alternatively, you could add a supportive caveat slightly later in the paragraph. Something like, therapy might help you navigate the heavy fog of this transition, but don't let anyone convince you it's merely a phase you need to snap out of.
That's strong.
Obviously, you don't have to use those exact words, but try to capture that vibe. These approaches maintain the empowering message while keeping the audience safe.
The word merely does a lot of heavy lifting there.
It really does.
It says, yes, this could be depression, but it is not just depression. It is an evolution. That's a very elegant fix.
It shows the audience that the author understands the full spectrum of the human experience. When the reader feels understood on both a medical and a spiritual level, they trust the guide completely.
Absolutely. Let's transition to the imagery the author uses to describe this evolution. Major strength here is that the material makes a strong case for embracing the unknown by highlighting the emotional weight of holding on to outgrown identities, utilizing vivid metaphors like a glitching phone or a body rejecting an organ.
Those are fantastic, striking concepts.
They are.
They immediately grab your attention because they take a very abstract idea, a soul outgrowing its life, and give it a tangible, mechanical parallel.
They do. But as we get deeper into the script, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere.
Yes, an atmospheric drift. Which brings us to a noticeable weakness in the middle section. Is the connection between these grand philosophical concepts and the reader's actual daily life fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster?
It does get a bit lofty.
Right now, the weakness is that the script relies so heavily on abstract,
high-level metaphors, that the narrative begins to feel untethered from the listener's daily reality. It tells the listener that their ambitious goals feel meaningless, but completely fails to show what that meaninglessness actually looks like on a random Tuesday morning.
I have to play devil's advocate again here, because what I really like about this part is the sheer ambition of the prose. The author is taking on the incredibly difficult task of trying to describe the indescribable, the invisible, internal feeling of a soul shifting. One might argue that keeping the language abstract makes the piece universally applicable. Like, if the author doesn't specify a Tuesday morning commute, the listener can project their own life onto the blank canvas, right?
That's a fascinating perspective. What are the potential limitations or counterarguments to that idea, though? The issue is that, counterintuitively, specificity is the true secret to universality in writing.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Because the text stays in the philosophical stratosphere for so long, circling the same themes of soul evolution and energetic shifts, the narrative gradually loses its gripping, visceral edge. The reader's mind eventually stops painting pictures because there are no physical objects left to render.
So the brain essentially glazes over.
Exactly. If every single sentence is an epic, sweeping declaration about higher selves and fundamental truth, the protagonist's actual, tangible environment disappears.
We don't see the messy living room?
Right.
Or the glowing laptop screen, or the half-drank cup of coffee. We lose the physical tension. And you're right, the contrast between a massive, internal, spiritual earthquake and the mundane requirement of having to go to the grocery store is where the real human drama actually lives.
Precisely. So the specific suggestion here is to ground the philosophical concepts with specific, relatable, and deeply mundane real-world vignettes. You need to break up the abstraction to deepen the emotional resonance.
So getting highly practical.
Yes. Show the audience the reset playing out in incredibly ordinary moments, rather than just repeatedly describing its mechanics.
Bring the camera all the way down from the cosmos and put it right over the listener's shoulder.
I love that phrasing. Yes, bringing the grand theory into a sharply focused, beautifully ordinary moment creates a profound jolt of recognition. Let's talk about some concrete examples of how to do this. Rather than just stating the broad idea that your social circle feels exhausting, describe a visceral, everyday moment.
What would that look like in practice?
You could write something like, "It is sitting in your car in the driveway for 20 minutes before walking into a job you fought 5 years for, realizing you feel absolutely nothing."
Oh, that's incredibly heavy. The sensory deprivation of a parked car perfectly captures that emptiness.
Right. Or to capture the social exhaustion, you could write, "It's staring at your phone when your oldest friend texts you and feeling an exhausting wave of dread instead of joy."
That is so much more relatable than just saying conversations feel hollow. It gives the listener a tangible handle to grasp onto.
It really does. You could also brilliantly illustrate the abstract concept of a liminal space by describing the physical sensation of throwing away a closet full of clothes that represent a past version of success. Again, there are a dozen ways you could format this, but the core idea is to anchor the profound strictly in the mundane.
It bridges the massive gap between the soul's evolution and the exhausting reality of navigating basic social obligations. I love that. Now, speaking of exhaustion, let's look closely at the section discussing the transition into the new life and the overall pacing of the piece.
This is probably the most structural critique we have, and it ties directly into the emotional fatigue we were just talking about. Building on that point, let's look at the pacing of the transition into the new life.
Let's do it.
The glaring weakness here is that the pacing maintains a relentless, intense, revelatory pitch from the very first sentence to the last paragraph. Because the text never downshifts, it ironically doesn't give the audience the quiet, liminal space or emotional breathing room that the text itself is advocating for.
That is an incredible irony.
Isn't it?
The text is literally telling the reader to stop, clear the metaphorical table, and wait patiently in the stillness. Yet the architectural structure of the writing itself fights against that advice. The sentences are dense, the paragraphs are long and unbroken, and the phrasing pushes the reader forward aggressively without any rest.
Think of your pacing like a song. Right now, this essay is a heavy metal track playing at maximum volume from the first word to the last. The relentless urgency becomes a bit of a wall of sound, lessening the impact of the final hopeful realizations.
It just batters.
Yes. The listener is simply exhausted by the driving cadence of the delivery. The writing never pauses to take a breath, so the reader isn't allowed to take a breath either.
If we are guiding the reader into a quiet, still place, the The prose itself needs to quiet down and become still. We really need to look at the musicality of the writing. It is about knowing when to play loudly and intensely, and knowing when to let the silence do the heavy lifting.
That is perfectly stated. So the primary suggestion here is to modulate the narrative pacing by structuring the script into distinct emotional movements. The chaotic breakdown, the quiet pause, and the slow rebuilding. The structural rhythm of the words needs to physically mirror the actual journey of a reset.
Form must follow function.
Exactly. When the author is discussing the frantic, panicked energy of the old life glitching and falling apart, the sentences absolutely can be rapid, dense, and intense.
Because that mimics the panic.
Right, but when the text inevitably moves into the blank page phase, the fundamental architecture of the writing must completely change to reflect that newfound emptiness.
If you are writing about confronting a terrifyingly blank page, you need to give the reader some literal blank space on the page. Or if this is being recorded as an audiobook or audio piece, a long pause in the audio.
Let's look at some concrete examples of how to actually format this. You can create a deliberate structural pause right after the glitching phone metaphor reaches its climax. You achieve this by transitioning into shorter, calmer sentences to represent that quiet phase.
So breaking up those massive blocks of text.
Yes. For instance, after the intense line, "It's clearing the table before the real feast arrives," use a literal pause or physical break in the text. Then transition into a softer, whisper-like tone.
Like what?
It could write, "What replaces it won't arrive all at once. It will come in whispers." By shifting the sentence length and rhythm here, you give the listener the literal space to exhale and process the heavy destruction phase before stepping into the reconstruction.
That drop in density is going to feel so good to the reader. It is like stepping out of a loud, crowded room into an empty hallway.
Exactly. And you don't have to use these exact line breaks, of course. You might choose to use solitary single-sentence paragraphs, or even just strategic hyphens to force a dramatic slowdown. The ultimate goal is to carefully orchestrate the pacing so the reader biologically feels the quietness you are describing to them.
It is brilliant because it turns the reading experience into a physical manifestation of the advice. You aren't just telling them how to reset, you're making them experience the rhythm of a reset through your syntax.
And when you combine all of these elements,
It transforms the piece.
it really does. When you nuance the mental health aspect so the reader feels safe, when you ground the abstract metaphors in Tuesday morning realities so they feel seen, and when you modulate the pacing so they can actually breathe, this piece goes from being a conceptually interesting essay to a genuinely transformative experience.
It creates a tremendous amount of trust. The reader feels held, guided, and understood on a very profound level. To recap, this piece has an incredibly strong emotional core and a deeply validating message for anyone going through a major life transition.
Without a doubt.
To elevate it further, focus on nuancing the discussion around depression to maintain audience trust. Anchor your beautiful abstract metaphors with concrete, everyday examples of what a reset looks like, and modulate the pacing to give the listener emotional breathing room that mirrors the journey itself. Thank you for sharing this profound piece with us. We highly encourage you to submit your next draft back in again for more feedback.